Yeah. I'm with Ben. And maybe you should introduce yourself.
My name is Ben.
Yeah, I already said that. No, but um, you can talk a little about maybe your YouTube channel, or maybe also where your family is from, because your family is from Ukraine, right?
Uh, Close enough. Yeah, not Ukraine, but nearby.
Yeah, because actually, I don't think I ever told you that, but my family is too, and is from Ukraine, but not Ukraine, uh, because my grandparents, um, uh, I don't know what you call this in English. They came from Bessarabia. Uh,
Yeah, that's where I'm from.
oh, that is where you're from. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, that explains your German name.
Are you Jewish as well? Why do you have a Jewish last
No, I'm German.
name?
But
So
people always get that confused. They I don't know. They always most of what people consider Jewish names are actually just German names.
so
So
it's just a common German name. Goldstein is as German as Schnitzel.
yeah, but only if you don't pronounce it like that. You gotta the German pronunciation would be Goldstein, and then of course you
Goldstein.
have some people that's some rather prejudiced people, especially on the internet, who think the definition of being Jewish would be people who have the word gold in their nickname on the internet.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So how are you, Emmanuel?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. Um, yeah. So it's interesting that our families are both from the same area.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it is.
there were there were many German settlements in that area,
Yeah.
and of course they already settled there. I mean like my ancestors already settled there like in the 1800s. They came after the Napoleonic wars, um, and they settled in that area. A lot of Germans came in the 1800s after the Napoleonic Wars. So technically, they weren't even Germans, right? They were living in that area. They were, the same as everyone else, and they were born there. And I, I'm assuming your family tree must be somewhat similar.
Yeah. Yeah. It has to be because it's German last name. So we're all Jews. So we came from there and must have made our way through Germany to Russia. So,
And yeah, and Russia has kind of like a habit of invading that area. They
yeah.
always do. So, um, I heard one of Putin's propaganda speeches, and I already told you I'm also making a video about that. But one of the things he said in his speech, justifying the war right now, um, was that the propaganda he's saying. He was saying like, yes, in Ukraine, Ukraine is full of Nazis. Yes,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
just like we've driven off the Nazis from Ukraine 80 years ago, we're doing it again now and driving out the Nazis from Ukraine. There are no Nazis in Ukraine now, and there were no Nazis
Probably
uh,
more Nazis in
uh,
Russia.
when the Red Army drove out my grandparents, because that was actually before the Second World War. There were no Nazis. They were born in that area. They already, my ancestors, like I said, they already went there in the 1800s, and and that was actually, they were actually driven out of that area even before the Second World War started, or before Germany got involved. Germany
Yeah.
had to do with it. Russia invaded the area, and it wasn't, it was an independent country. It wasn't, Germany wasn't there yet. They only came later, and uh, but that area always gets invaded. And
Yeah.
everyone for some strange reason wants to invade that area, and it's exactly the area. My grandfather was born. Like the closest city that people know is actually Odessa. So he was born in that area.
Yeah. Sorry. Clear out the mess a little bit. No, I can see in the mirror now. You can see that. Sorry.
What are you doing?
Just trying to make it a little bit more neat because the mirror, there's some piles over there. Now that's fine. That should be fine.
Yeah, it doesn't matter anyway. You can kind of see how messy my room is, right?
It's
But it doesn't
blurred.
matter since I just put the filter on it.
Yeah, it's blurred.
Yeah, so Russia has kind of a history of invading that area. They always do, and they always make up some excuse that isn't true because, like I said, um, the only Germans that were there at that time were just my ancestors and my grandparents and just German settlers that have been there for hundreds of years. And the Nazis didn't come until after Russia already invaded that area.
Yeah. Right. That sounds about right. Yeah. So, what were we going to talk about? What do you want to talk about?
That's a nice starting point, isn't it? We can go from there.
Yeah. I don't know. It's the history of that region. The history in general is very interesting. So, to my best knowledge, Ukraine, because it's further to the west, was one of the originators of Russia. Because most of Russia was in the hands of Mongols and Tartars, because mostly it's in Asia, and they actually controlled Eastern Europe. And one of the first Russian princes who drove back the Mongols, the Tartars, I think he was Ukrainian, and what would now be considered Ukrainian. Back then, there was no distinction. It was just different tribes in the area. But it was in the Ukraine. Back then, it was known as Little Russia, or Malorussia, which means small Russia. It was a small kingdom. And he's the one who drove back Tartars. And if I'm not mistaken, that's where Russia originated from. And the Ukrainian language is actually much, I believe, to my understanding, it's closer to the ancient Slavic than modern Russian, because Russia became an international empire and it absorbed a lot of other languages like French, maybe possibly German, and got modernized. Whereas in the Ukrainians were more insulated, and the language is actually closer to the older language. That's as far as I know.
But you actually speak Russian, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
you don't speak Ukrainian. You speak Russian.
No, so Bessarabia, right? That's like what's now considered Moldova, I believe. It's basically Moldova.
Yeah,
is really.
Yeah. My family was talking German, or more precisely Swabian.
Swabian?
German dialect.
Oh, yeah.
But
So
they also spoke, the other language. They probably, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think my grandfather actually spoke Russian as well. I think he didn't speak Ukrainian. He spoke Russian. Yes.
So my grandparents grew up speaking Romanian, because Moldova is really part of Romania. It's the same culture. It just got, politically, it got chipped off of Romania and became Moldova, a republic of the Soviet Union, whereas in Romania was just a satellite country. And so they grew up in the Romanian village under the Romanian, I guess it was Romanian king or something. I don't know what they called their leader back then, but it wasn't part of Russia before the Second World War.
Yeah, right.
Actually,
That that's why before the Second World War, or even at the time when the Second World War started happening, but before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, long before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, um, exactly, Russia invaded Romania. Yes.
yeah, yeah. Russia, I guess, had been through there a few times, but I believe it was independent back when my grandparents were coming up in the early 1900s.
Exactly.
1900s.
It used to be Bessarabia used to be its own country.
Hmm. Yeah, so yeah, and I don't know how all those countries, but Moldova, Romania, Bessarabia, I don't know when they were all independent or not. But they grew up in the Romanian village speaking Romanian among Romanians, and they didn't know Russian because Russians weren't in power. After World War II, that's when the Soviets took over Romania, at least most recently. Um, and so then we grew up, my parents and I grew up speaking Russian. And my parents speak Romanian, but I don't. I didn't get far enough in the school system to learn Romanian, which is they still taught it to kids in Moldova, in the later grades, but not, if you didn't speak it at home, you wouldn't necessarily speak it going to school. So yeah, I don't really have much sense of Romanian or Moldavian culture. I mean, some, but not as much as I do of Russian culture. Russian culture is what we grew up with.
Mhm.
Yeah, because we're Jews, we're not Romanians, so we're not assimilated to Romania. Um, but also because of the Soviet Union, like my
Yeah,
grandparents.
that was the same with my grandparents. They didn't feel accepted uh, in Bessarabia because they were Germans,
Mhm.
and and just like with your family in their village, they had their own language, and so they didn't really yeah they some especially my grandfather he never because he was a child back then, and he was never accepted by the other children. When he was in Bessarabia, he wasn't accepted because he was German. And then when he had to flee from the Red Army, um, and they fled back to Germany, he wasn't accepted in Germany either, because
Mm.
because he was seen as well.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure as what they, because most Germans don't even have a concept of where Bessarabia is or what that is. They don't even know that country at all. So to them it was just like, well, some weird foreigner. So
Yeah, yeah. There's always, I mean, brothers fight, cousins fight, everybody fights. It's just what people do. You live on the other side of the street, so so we fight. It's simple as that. Um, yeah, but let's see. So, my family history, we don't know very far back. Partly it's because the Germans killed so many people in our family line. When before World War II, um, Romania or Russia or somebody, they there was a Nazi ship that came to port in Romania, and the powers that be, or the Germans, demanded some hostages. So my grandpa went on the boat, on this Nazi boat, flying the swastika as one of the hostages. But then they released him. But then later the war started, and everybody was trying to get out. But the Soviet military was also evacuating, and they controlled all the means of transportation across this river. So citizens were just kind of stuck, and the civilians. And so my grandpa and some folks went downriver and they saw the submerged barge. And so they took pails and got the water out of the barge, and they got their families on, and it was like with a rope, they started pulling themselves across. And then the army saw that, but they were already on their way, and so they were able to evacuate themselves that way to Kazakhstan or somewhere like that. But pretty much all the Jews were murdered by not by the Nazis, but by their neighbor Romanians when the Nazis got there, and that's kind of what happened. And then so a lot of people who evacuated ended up going right to Central Russia, to Asia, and a lot of the older folks died from starvation, and people in general, there was starvation. So my great grandparents died from starvation. Then after the war, my grandpa and grandma returned to Moldova. All their Jewish neighbors were pretty much murdered, except for the people that had managed to flee, which was a very few amount. And everything was bombed out. And my grandma, she survived because she was a seamstress. She learned how to sew, and so she would sew and make money that way for food. My grandpa, because the Moldavians weren't loyal to Russia, they weren't allowed to join to go fight, so they were used in building railroads and stuff like that in the army. So that's what how my grandpa spent the war.
Yeah,
And I have a funny, your grandpa died in the Holocaust. He fell off the guard tower. That's a joke, but I hope you get the joke. I hope you get the joke.
No, but he did. He, just like you, he always told me these stories about what he saw and what happened during the war, and mainly about how he had to flee, and he had to flee multiple times, and his home was destroyed multiple times, and there were also massacres, and there was one particular.
Wasn't he in Germany by then?
There was one particular massacre where he was basically the sole survivor, and and he always told me about that, and mainly about the massacre. He told me that story like 10 times, over and over again, and he never told. There was one story that he didn't tell me up until the very end, when he was already very old and was already about to die. He just sort of casually mentioned that he saw Jews being shot. And and obviously I think of my grandfather as a good person, so I was like, well, why didn't you try to help them? And of course that was a naive question, because obviously if he had tried to help them, it would have endangered himself, right?
Yeah. Was it Germany or Bessarabia?
Yeah, where he saw Jews being shot. That was in Germany.
Oh, so he was okay. Okay, I got you.
Well, actually, it wasn't in Germany, but it was Germany at that time. So yeah. So anyway, later I kept asking him questions about it, because I just couldn't understand why he didn't help, and I realized that even though he really couldn't have helped, and without endangering his own life, that wasn't the reason why he didn't help, because like I said, my grandfather really was a good person, and he was the kind of person who really would risk his own life to save the lives of others. So he would normally do that. So that wasn't the reason why he didn't help. The reason he didn't help is because he believed this, kind of propaganda against the Jews, because he was indoctrinated with that and grew up with that, and that's why he didn't help. Because it's not like he really believed that, but if you constantly bombarded with this kind of propaganda, and then if you see Jews being shot, it, at the very least, it makes you hesitate. And that's all it needs to do, because you don't have too much time, right? You have to act at that moment or it's too late. So if you hesitate, because because this kind of propaganda does make you hesitate, that's all it needs to do, and then it's that's too late. So
so there was massacres and bombings by the Russians. That's well,
Both.
except for the Jews.
Yes. Well, there were actually many bombings and many massacres on both sides. But the main one, the one where he was the sole survivor, pretty much, and the one he kept talking about, that was actually committed by Polish resistance fighters, and
Oh, wow.
my family and my grandparents. And my grandfather, he was not in the army. He was not a soldier, and he had nothing to do with the war. He was, he was a refugee himself. He had to flee from the Red Army, and and then he basically the whole time during the war, he constantly had to flee. So my family, it was just farmers and refugees.
Yeah.
But the Polish resistance fighters, they didn't make any distinction. So they actually in that massacre, they actually specifically targeted German civilians.
And would the Germans also kill people when they were in the area, other than Jews?
Yeah, but like I said, my grandfather was not in the army. So usually those kinds of massacres are committed by the soldiers. So yeah, like I said, other than my grandfather seeing Jews being shot by I think it was by the Wehrmacht actually. He didn't have anything to do with any such atrocities,
Right.
other
But
than ignoring it when he saw it.
but when the Germans were in the area, would they also be killing people?
Well, yes, but that would be done by the Wehrmacht then, or by the
Jews.
the
They're killing
soldiers,
Jews.
or not even necessarily by the Wehrmacht. Well, actually, the cliche is that it was mainly the SS that was committing war crimes, and it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As far as your grandpa being a good person but not doing anything, I think that level of decent of good to do something to lay down your life for for anybody, for people that you don't even know, who you have a prejudice against. I think that also needs to be kind of brainwashed into you. I don't you because it has to come from society, right? Because innately,
Why would you call that brainwashing, though? I think that's actually a natural reaction. I think that's how people should be.
yeah,
They should help other people
yeah.
when they see something terrible happening.
Yeah, but I mean, I think when I say brainwashed, I mean we're just reflections of society by and large, and unless we get some information independently of that. So unless the society is one where you will protect even people that you don't like, if the society doesn't like a certain group of people, generally people will not protect them.
Yeah, like I said, with my grandfather, because when you see something like that happening, you don't have a lot of time to contemplate. You either act
Yeah.
now or you don't act because it's going to be too late. So you only in most of situations like that, you only have a split second to decide what you're going to do. And of course, this kind of propaganda makes you hesitate. And that's all it needs to do to prevent people from helping. Because if they hesitate, then they're probably gonna miss the opportunity to help.
Yeah. Yeah, but like even with the victims themselves, the simplest thing to do when somebody comes to your door with a gun is just don't do anything, right? Just ignore them. And that's going to make their job a lot harder than if everybody patiently listens to them and lets them put them into a gas chamber. But it's not common sense if that's how you think.
How is not doing anything helping? I don't see how not doing anything is helping.
Well, when you're following orders, you're helping. When you're not following orders, you're not. You're resisting. You,
Oh, so you mean
you're helping them.
like if you're Jewish and like the Gestapo knocks at your door and says, "Hey, get in the van," and you just don't do it, or what do you mean? Or
Yeah,
you mean like,
you just don't do it, but it has to be something that you're taught. Because
yeah,
if
but at
society isn't
at that
thinking that
point it's
way,
too late, because if you don't do it, they'll because that's actually what my grandfather saw. It was exactly a situation like that. The Gestapo came knocking at the door, and there were Jews in the house, and they were ordered to get in the van, so to say. I don't know if it was a van, but they had some method of transportation, and they were supposed to be transported away, presumably to some camp or something. And they didn't do it, and that's why they were shot.
yeah, but if they do it, then they just make the killing of their people that much more easy, right? You can't kill 6 million people who just lie in bed, and you have to, put a round into every single person, as opposed to 6 million people where you can, get 10,000 in one shot, by putting them into gas chambers all day. You know.
Yeah, well, psychologically, of course, it was always small steps. It wasn't like oh, get into the gas chamber, like it wasn't like that right away. It started small, and it was always just small steps, and it was
Yeah.
always like and the people who were persecuted, they always felt like, oh, if they just comply with that next step, then
Yeah.
then that's
Yeah.
all they have to do. So it started with small things. um uh, well, actually, it started with infringements upon their private property, but actually, everyone's private property was infringed, because the National Socialists were socialists after all, so they didn't respect the private property of anyone. So from if you were like a Jew, you'd be like, oh well, it's not right that they infringe on my property rights, but you'd be thinking, well, they infringe on the property rights of others as well, right? Maybe not as much, but you don't think in a situation like that, you don't think it is such a big deal, and you think, oh well, that's all they're gonna do, but of course, if you comply with that, then the next step comes, and the next step, and the next step, and of course, eventually you're gonna end up in a concentration camp, but that's only the last step. And before that, there were all kinds of little small steps, that led up to that.
Yeah, it's human psychology, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course, at any of those steps, you could have just said, well, I'm not gonna comply, right?
Yeah.
And if the majority of people would have done that, they would have not been able to go through with that. But of course, the majority of people are not going to do that, usually, because the punishment on the individual, if the majority refuses to go along with it, then you can't, persecute or make a majority of people disappear, right?
Mhm.
Um, but as long as it's just like individuals that stand up, you can certainly make individuals disappear. And of course, the punishments on the individual is always harsher, you know, um, because eventually you're probably gonna end up in a labor camp anyway. But even then, you might survive, Whereas if you stand up, you run the risk of getting shot right away. Of course, they
So,
can't
yeah.
shoot they can't shoot everybody, but individually, everyone is afraid of the punishment that they're gonna face for standing up, as an individual.
So, I want to bring something up and see. Just we can talk about it to whatever depth you want to, but I think a lot about persecution of Falun Gong in China, right? And we all have our perspectives on it, but just from the most basic perspective and what we just said, like I think if this was like an American being persecuted, um, like a real patriotic, like Stone Cold American, they would maybe have a similar response to where like you're giving me orders, you're threatening me, I don't care, go kick rock, I don't care what you say. And I think just on the human level, having that kind of stoicism makes it really hard to do anything to you.
You were, I'm not quite sure if I understand what you mean. You were mentioning Falun Gong, and I talked about Falun Gong in the past, and I also, I don't hide the fact that, sometimes, and I do that in public, sometimes I go to public parks and do the exercises, I like, the Falun Gong exercises, which are like, like Qigong exercises. And of course, Falun Gong is being persecuted in China. And I also have friends who have been persecuted. There's, for example, there is one Chinese Falun Gong practitioner who lives in my city here in Germany, and he was actually deported. He applied, and that was in 2004. He applied for asylum, and his asylum was refused because the judge, and I was there at at the court, and the judge said, the reason he's not granting asylum is because he's not in danger, he wouldn't be in danger in China. So they deported him back to China, and the moment the moment, and it was the whole family. It was not just it wasn't just my friend, because he was married, and so he had a wife and young children, and so the moment they stepped off the plane in China, they were arrested, and he was sentenced to forced labor, and he was put into a forced labor camp, and for many years he was in a forced labor camp, and then he finally managed to get out, and he managed to flee again, and to come back here, and then they were like, "Oh yeah, we made a mistake. You were right. You will be persecuted."
Yeah, I guess
our mistake, and now he's here again, and now they granted him refugee status, but only after he spent several years in a forced labor camp in China.
Yeah, what I was. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to explain that, so that people know that about the persecution, and also that I know people, that I personally know people who have been persecuted and who were in forced labor camps in China simply for doing a meditation in public parks.
Yeah, but to try to clarify what I was saying is that, like, and this isn't all people, in this country or in general, but I think that in this country, some people have a real good sense of just not caring what people in charge say, because freedom and independence, that spirit. And even when people who have power over them tell them to do something, if it's something that they shouldn't do, it doesn't bother them. And just the fact that they're not bothered by it and they continue to do whatever they need to do, it makes it harder for bad people to harm them. Just that mindset.
Yeah, but you're an American now, and so you're in America and you're talking about Americans.
Yeah, right. That culture doesn't exist anymore.
Germans are not known for having that mentality, and neither are Russians.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anywhere else to this extent. But that that mindset, is an example for others. Can be an example for others.
Yeah, I think that's the right mindset, and I do value that kind of attitude that Americans have, about freedom and valuing their constitution and so on. We Germans need to have that attitude more as well, because we have that attitude a little bit, but not enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just how it is. People are different, cultures are different. Obviously, there's special circumstances in every single place. So, it's normal. It's natural. Um, One thing, unless is there something else you want to bring up at the moment?
Go ahead.
Yeah. One thing it was on my mind is, um, I guess, right now with the Ukraine, because of my background, I know a lot of people from there, and it's to me, it's not surprising in any way. It's naturally exactly what's going to happen, but um, I think it just indebted to just to speak the truth, in any regard. And so, like, there, and it's not just Russian or Ukrainians, it's a lot of kind of just kind of simple people, I guess, or just kind of weak, superficial people that, they're putting on the Ukrainian flag or they're making a meme. Not to say there's anything wrong with a meme can go a long way, but basically they just do very like virtues. They do a lot of virtue signaling. Even their outrage is just all it is virtue signaling. Like, look at me, look how great I am because I'm outraged by
Yeah,
this.
the people in the Ukraine, they can't eat virtue signaling.
Yeah, they've never done anything for their community. They've never invested any time or mental effort to think about the state of their neighbors or their town, even though they ran away from that place, which they all of a sudden they care so much about. They actually, packed up their bags and voted with their feet to not help out their country and go live in another country. And when they're in another country, they don't, do anything to help that country and that people, which is now their people. They just live their lives, not knowing a thing. But yet when something happens a million miles away, they don't do anything of any significance, but yet they're outraged. And that's a really that's a really that's a really dramatic display.
Well, in that sense, Germans are actually doing better, because I feel I feel they kind of understand that problem, and so instead of just being outraged and flying a blue and yellow flag, a lot of Germans, and obviously that's not as easy to do in the US and for Americans because of the distance involved. But the Ukraine isn't very far from Germany. It's just across Poland. And as you know, we Germans have no problem getting across Poland. We can do that very quickly, even if we want to.
Yeah.
So it's not very far. So a lot of Germans are actually not just virtual signaling, but they actually are packing supplies together, collecting supplies, like food and blankets and stuff
people
like
doing that here too.
And drive it over to the Ukraine. A lot of people, even do that by themselves. They just, organize a truck and drive it over to the Ukraine.
I thought you were going to say a lot of Germans are going over there to fight the Russians, which
no.
That's pretty cool. No. That's a pretty cool thing to do. But at the same time, like, there's probably real problems, in Germany that they could apply themselves to. And I think doing that would strengthen Germany, and by butterfly effect, it might strengthen the Ukrainians more than them volunteering to go fight Russia.
Right. Of course, um, of course, what's happening in the Ukraine isn't the only problem in the world right now. There are lots of things going on, lots of stuff happening. So yeah, in a way, and it's the same. I don't know. I don't know how it is in the US, but I'm assuming it's the same in the US, right? All the major media is, at least that's how it was in Germany. Like for the last 12 days, the German media has only been reporting about what's going on in the Ukraine. And before that, they were reporting 24/7 about Corona, and now they stopped reporting about that, and now it's suddenly all about the Ukraine, and they completely forgot about the virus now. So it's weird, how the media is always focused on one thing, and people's attention is always focused on one thing, but of course there's more than one issue in the world. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's the case. But I think ultimately it's a good thing, like it's not conflict is bad, and what's happened is what they've done is bad. But I think the way the universe works is everything filters out to a positive result, and however it's prearranged. So for instance, with whatever happens, it serves to kind of jolt people out of their mindlessness, whether it's the Ukrainians who are fighting them off, or people elsewhere who see that the world is not as mechanical as the powers that be want to make it out to be.
Yeah. Since you mentioned that, I wanna there's one last thing I want to mention as well. Since you mentioned conflict, and of course, there's lots of conflict going on now, and of course, everyone knows that conflict is bad, but still, it seems that, well, it seems like not everyone knows that, and that's the problem, and especially since we were talking about regimes like the Soviet Union and China, and communist regimes, especially in such regimes, and especially in communism. um, Communism teaches essentially that struggle and conflict would be a good thing, and of course
Right.
it isn't, but that's why you often have conflicts in countries controlled by a communist government or by a communist party, because communists believe conflict to be a good thing, and they think that by conflict they can advance society, which of course isn't the case at all. But they believe that, and that's why a lot of bad stuff is happening.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know if you want to get into this, but communism is satanic, right? In its inception, it was all about devil worship, and it just got transformed into a political.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Uh, so I actually did. I'm not faking this. I actually did have to cough, but at
Yeah.
the same time, I do want to signal that just throwing out there that communism is satanic is maybe a little too much. I don't disagree with you necessarily, but I feel that if you say something like that, you kind of have to explain. Um, yeah, you have to do a lot of explanation.
Let me put it in a less supernatural way. So communism basically is based on the worst impulses of people, and so people are prone to fight, and even can even be fun. Sport is competition, and that can be a lot of fun. And even war can be the biggest high that a person can get. But to base yourself in those things is like the opposite of good. You know what I mean?
No, 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 it's horrible, and war actually causes obviously a lot of suffering. Any sort of conflict causes suffering, so it's not a good thing at all. But I feel okay if you still have a little time. I feel then, since you,
Yeah.
you since you blurted out that you believe communism is satanic, I feel we now have to explain it a little, because I actually kind of agree with you. Not well. I sort of agree with you, but I feel that, well, I putting it that way is oversimplifying it, and I feel this is an important point, and it warrants some explanation. And I already started doing that. You've watched my video, where I was explaining about the meaning behind communist symbols, right?
Mhm.
You've watched that, right?
Yeah.
So I was actually already starting to explain that or get into that, and I want to do a follow-up video, and where I already hinted at it, but I want to explain it in more detail, and then I'm going to explain how these symbols, and I actually already hinted at that in my first video, that all these communist symbols all have occult meaning. There is occult meaning behind it. Um, so yeah, the way I would put it isn't that communism is satanic. I think that's oversimplifying it, but it does have occult elements behind it, and that becomes very obvious when you look at the symbols. But it's not just the symbols; it's also the ideology itself. That whole ideology of seeing struggle and conflict as a good thing, that's
Mhm.
actually also something that comes from, well, let's not call them satanic groups, but occult groups believe that.
Yeah.
So, mainly Luciferians, and, then a lot of people are thinking, well, Luciferians aren't Luciferian Satanists? Well, yeah, from a Christian perspective, they would certainly both be seen as Satanists, but actually they themselves, and that's why I want to make that distinction, and because they themselves wouldn't see themselves as Satanists, um, yeah,
Yeah. I think you said something about those people worshipped Saturn,
yes.
right? And something else
Well,
I've seen.
uh, yeah, all the, so far, I haven't gotten into the occult meaning yet. I'm going to do that in my second video. So far, I just explained that all the communist symbols, all the prominent communist symbols, all of them, uh, have occult meaning, and the occult meaning all relates to Saturn. Those are all symbols for Saturn.
Yeah. So tell me what you think about this. And this may be a bit out of our ballpark, but something else I've seen is that in a previous prehistoric times, Saturn was in place of today's sun, right? And so this is something
No,
like
no,
a
yeah, yes, and no. Um, it wasn't in place of today's sun, but it was a sun, or it was regarded. It never was. It never took the place of our sun, obviously, but it was regarded as a sort of second sun, or even as the main sun, because obviously the sun is much bigger than Saturn. But um, there is that theory, and then we have to go into plasma cosmology, which explains that very well. Um, so the theory in uh, uh, in cosmology nowadays is that the orbit of Saturn shifted, and there was a time before that orbit shifted when Saturn was much closer to the Earth. So obviously Saturn was never the sun and never took the place of the sun, but it there was a time, and that also, if you look into ancient mysticism, that confirms that as well. There was a time when Saturn had much more importance to the people, and was visible in the sky much more prominently than our sun is today. So so it had very, very deep, very important meaning to ancient pagans, and that's where all these occult beliefs regarding Saturn originate from.
and somehow there was a shift because this is a vestige of a older kind of arrangement, that cosmic arrangement, but somehow there was a shift in modern times where these occult practices, which were at one time, worshiping Saturn, they became worshippers of Lucifer, right?
Yes, well, it evolved or devolved, if you will, into that. So, for example, even the word, Saturn and Satan,
Yeah.
is similar. And of course, what do we think of when we think of Satan? Horns.
Yeah.
Why? Because Saturn was depicted with horns. Because how shall I explain that? I have to make a separate video about that to explain it in detail. But see, just like the moon is cyclical, and just like the moon has a crescent, Saturn Saturn actually has two. Saturn actually has both. Saturn is cyclical. Saturn has a crescent, and on top of that, Saturn has the rings, right? So, and be it the crescent or be it the rings, both of these things look like horns. I would have to show an image to make it more clear, but you can see how the rings of Saturn can appear to be horns, because all of these are planetary deities, right? In ancient paganism, gods and planets were the same things. Their deities all corresponded to planets. So the planetary deity of Saturn was oftentimes depicted with horns, and that's where you get that idea with with the horns from.
Yeah. But how did it become evil?
Well, evil is maybe the question is a bit too broad, because it involves a lot of things, and it involves a lot of historical events, and it didn't become evil overnight. We're talking about many thousands of years of human civilization. So, but anyway, when Saturn was prominent and prominently visible from the Earth, all these pagan religions had Saturn as their focus. But then when Saturn moved away further from the Earth and was not as prominent anymore, they shifted their worship to other planetary deities. Well, all the other, especially in ancient Greek and ancient Rome, all the planets were worshipped. So the focus went away from having Saturn as the main focus of worship, at least in mainstream paganism. But of course, there was always there were always groups that continued to worship Saturn, and then over the progression of many hundreds of years, they evolved into the occult groups that are still present nowadays, and that then use such symbolism as we can see in communist imagery nowadays. And I explained that symbolism in my video about that.
Mm-hmm. I see.
And of course, as for evil, well, there was of course also a period of time where Saturn worship also involved sacrifices. So yeah, I guess that you could call that evil, I guess. Yes.
Interesting. Okay, I gotta get going. So we can maybe stop here and just I have a few minutes. I'm going to stop my recording on my end. All right, so I stopped my recording. I don't know. You want to
Okay.
yours?
Bye-bye.
Bye.